And to discuss the legacy of Hugo Chavez and the current situation in Venezuela, I'm joined by George Ciccariello-Maher. He is the author of We Created Chavez, A People's History of the Venezuelan Revolution. He joins us from Drexel University in Philadelphia. George, thanks so much for joining us. I guess it's safe to say you wrote the book on Chavez, the revolution. So what is his legacy a year after his death?
I think the legacy of Chavez a year after his death actually has a few aspects. One is really the individual aspect, which plays a major role in who Chavez was. Here was someone who was willing to stand up against a corrupt and violent democracy as it turned to neoliberal structural adjustment programs and slaughtered, hundreds or thousands of people some 25 years ago today. Chavez was one of those people who stood up and said, this is enough, took a daring stand in attempting to overthrow this government, and this is what converted him in many ways into a popular hero and the stuff of legend. And then when we get to the question of policies, there are two aspects that I think are important. One is dealing with what's called the social debt to the poor. The fact that despite oil wealth for decades, the poorest Venezuelans were suffering and were living in poverty. And so the first thing that, especially after recovering the oil wealth, that Chavez and the Bolivarian government did was to help cut poverty dramatically, to help eliminate illiteracy, as your report said, to increase the egalitarian nature of this Venezuelan society from being one of the most unequal in Latin America to being one of the most equal. But then the second aspect is crucial, and it's the aspect of participatory democracy, the idea that the Venezuelan people get to play what is called a protagonistic role in history and in politics through direct democracy, councils, and other participatory venues.
In many respects, he was larger than life. Martin Markovitz mentioned that. And I saw a video on YouTube today where you were discussing your book in Philadelphia some months back. And you said in this conversation that Maduro's personality cannot assuage the tensions within his own bloc, like Chavez. So can you talk about the difficulty of having to follow in the footsteps of Chavez?
Well, here's, again, someone larger than life, and no one can really step in and fulfill that. And even if an individual had such, capacities, you're stepping to a very different moment in history, right? Maduro's task is to govern and continue a process as opposed to begin and break through into a new process. So this is a very different task. And Maduro is a very faithful representative of what Chavez stood for. He's someone who is continuing the policies and attempting to drive them forward, but at the same time, he can't do so in the same exact way that Chavez did, and he knows this. He knows that he needs to cultivate different kinds of leadership among different groups of people within Venezuelan society if this process is going to move forward, and above all, he needs to maintain the active role of the popular organizations and the social movements that form the basis and the backbone of this revolution.
Diego Moyo Campos, who used to work in the Attorney General's office there in Venezuela, now a political analyst at IHS Global, is quoted as saying this about Venezuela, and I want to get your thoughts on it. He said, it's a perfect storm which is brewing in Venezuela. What we're seeing is a political vacuum left unfilled since Chavez's death, escalating pro- and anti-government protests, and a further contraction of the economy in 2014 and 2015, with record-high inflation levels, shortages of food and basic goods, including medicines. That sounds very dire. Is that a good read on what's actually happening?
I don't think so. I think it misses the mark on nearly every aspect, in the sense that to say that there's a vacuum simply because the individual of Chavez is no longer with us is to act as though this were a one-man show, which is not true. We've got talking about hundreds of thousands and even millions of active participants in the Bolivarian process who are there, standing solid, driving forward, building new organizations and spaces for participation, and who are not going to allow this, to change just because of the whim of some opposition protesters in the streets. On the other side, this overstates really the weight of these protests. They certainly have a great symbolic weight, especially in the U.S. media, for example, but these are not huge numbers. The protests are not reaching across the line and connecting to the poor, connecting to the Chavista base. And this is really something that's going to doom them to just being another play in this opposition playbook, which is attempted over and over again to remove the Chavistas from power. And if they don't manage to attract the poor, that's simply not going to happen.
Well, George, we're going to have to leave it there. George Ciccariello-Maher joining us from Philadelphia. Thanks so much.